Well, good morning to you all. This is the second in a series of talks on Black Presbyterian history, focused on the lives of some very important figures in that history. And I just want to say, as a self-criticism, that until I got into this subject, I knew very little about any of these people, which is a reflection of a larger reality, and that is white Presbyterians tend to know very little about Black Presbyterian history. This is an attempt to begin to correct that. Last time I talked about Henry Highland Garnett, who lived during the slavery era and whose main challenge was confronting the phenomenon of slavery. This week I want to talk about a man who comes later, Francis Grimke, who had his effective ministry in the period running from roughly the 1880s through the 1920s. Francis Grimke, the 1880s through the 1920s. And of course, the big challenge in that era is not slavery, it's Jim Crow. It's segregation. Segregation is, I think, appropriately understood as an attempt to undo the process of Reconstruction that began after the Civil War. And I can put it simply and say, in my judgment, it was an attempt to resubjugate Blacks, to put them back in the subjugated position that they had been in the time of slavery, even though the institution of slavery had been outlawed. And the quotation that I used from Grimke to summarize this session, the theme of this session, captures, I think, very well his attitude towards it. He says, the institution is gone, but its spirit remains. The institution is gone, but its spirit remains. Segregation in the era of Grimke's lifetime was a terrible phenomenon. I'll be just blunt and editorialize about it in that way. It was a time of lynchings and riots and the KKK and a rather systematic effort to exclude Blacks from the rights that they had been given at the time of the passage of that legislation after the Civil War. In this presentation, I'm going to talk briefly about Grimke's life to begin with. Then I will talk briefly about his theology, and I'll explain why I think I can be relatively brief about his theology. And then I'll spend the latter part, the latter part of my remarks talking about his response to the phenomenon of segregation. As I do that, I will get into the strategic issues that were confronted by the whole Black community in that period. I'll also talk toward the end of my presentation about his view of the role of the church, both the Black church and the white church. I find that part of his thinking very, very interesting, and perhaps you will too. Francis Grimke was born in 1850. He was born in 1850. He was a slave. He was born a slave. He was born in South Carolina. His father was a planter, a man of some wealth and prominence. His grandfather was a judge in the South Carolina Supreme Court. This was a prominent family. It was a prominent family in South Carolina, and more broadly, it was a prominent family in the nation. And in part, it was a prominent family in the nation for an ironic reason. Two of the daughters of the grandfather had become very strong proponents of abolition. The daughters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, are really important figures in the history of the struggle against slavery, but also the suffragette movement. They left the South, moved to the North, and became very, very active in those causes. They're famous figures in the history of both of those movements. And they, especially late in their lives, helped Francis Grimke and his brother, Archibald Grimke, in their attempt to get an education and then to pursue their professional lives. Francis Grimke himself not only was enslaved, but was a runaway slave who was captured and brought back and put in jail and almost died in jail. He was treated so badly in the jail there in Charleston, South Carolina, that he nearly died. His mother rescued him and nursed him back to health. He was on the brink of death, and that was the sort of the background. He remained enslaved and even was forced to work in the Confederate Army during the period of the Civil War, and only found freedom at the end of that war with the emancipation of slaves at that time. He's another one of these figures, very, very interesting to me. Another one of these figures, so common in Presbyterian history, who just had a kind of zeal for education. And it's particularly important part of the story of the Black experience. I've already talked about Henry Highland Garnet as a man who just could hardly get enough education and had that wonderful classical education, which served him so well when he became an important public figure. Similar thing with Grimke. Grimke was drawn to education, and through in part the assistance of one of these aunts, one of these Grimke aunts, he was able to go to Lincoln University. Lincoln University in Pennsylvania was known at the time as a kind of Presbyterian as a kind of Black Princeton, and the reason for that was that it was founded by Presbyterians. It was part of a very strong, I want to stress, insofar as there's a good part to the white Presbyterian response to the phenomenon of slavery and then subsequently of segregation. It's the Presbyterian emphasis on education for Blacks, again and again and again. That is manifest in the story. At any rate, he goes to Lincoln University, and then after graduating from Lincoln University, and both he and his brother went to Lincoln University and graduated. He went on to Howard Law School. His brother went on to Harvard Law School. And his brother, by the way, became then a very distinguished attorney and a very important figure in the rise of the NAACP. Francis Grimke did not apparently take well to law school, or maybe the other way to put it would be to say he felt the call to the ministry. You can sort of turn it either way. And by the way, during the time he was at Howard, he was going to 15th Street Presbyterian Church. That's a very interesting little side note that I'll come back to and mention as we go along more fully. He left Howard Law School and went to, and this is a very important note, several of you raised questions last time, good questions about theological seminaries and the relationship between all of this ferment that I'm talking about in theological seminaries. It's in the 1870s, 60s, and 70s that Princeton in particular begins to admit Black students. And he's one of the first people to go to Princeton Seminary as a Black man and to graduate in 1879. Very important note. So note, unlike Henry Highland Garnet, Grimke is somebody who's got a pretty good theological education. And that means in turn that he has got, I would say, I don't want to say that he's got a better theology, that would be the wrong way to put it, but he's got a more nuanced, a more sophisticated way of thinking theologically. And that served him well because very shortly after being at Princeton, he was called to the pastorate of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church. I've often thought that's an interesting trajectory. He was there as a student, and then not long after, he comes back called to serve as the pastor of that church. Very, very prominent church in the Black community in Washington in the 19th century. It's mentioned extensively in a famous book about Blacks in Washington in that period. The title of the book is Black Bourgeoisie. Famous sociologist captured that phrase, and it's really a discussion of how they're developed in Washington in the aftermath of the Civil War, a kind of upper middle class, if we can put it that way, of professionals, of highly educated Black people who were drawn, among other places, to the 15th Street Presbyterian Church. He served most of his adult life as the minister of that church. There was one period when he left, apparently for health reasons, and went to a church in Jacksonville, Florida. But for the most part, he was in the pastorate at the 15th Street Church. And that's a very important, I want to characterize it as a platform for him to pursue the causes that were of interest to him. In that period of his life, he also married a famous woman, Charlotte Forten, Forten, who was a Black woman from a very prominent Black abolitionist family, who was devoted to two causes: the education of Blacks. She'd been one of those women who, as soon as the opportunity presented itself, migrated south to help meet the challenge of this enormous population of Blacks who were being liberated, who had no education at all, who were completely illiterate. That was one of the great challenges of the Reconstruction era, and the churches in particular stepped in there and provided all kinds of resources. And she was one of the people who was very active in that. She was also a very strong suffragette, and I think in part because of that, he was too. He was very much devoted to the cause of suffrage for women, as well as, of course, trying to recover in the period of segregation the right to vote, which had been given to Blacks in principle, but then denied so systematically in the Jim Crow era. He was very, very active in the church. In a way, I think I've already said this last time, that separates him somewhat from Henry Highland Garnett. Henry Highland Garnett was a Presbyterian pastor and was certainly influential among at least Black clergy. But Henry Highland Garnett was mainly a public figure. I said last time that he made his great impact by being deeply involved in civic affairs, public affairs, really on a very high level of influence in the Black community in the abolition struggle. He was less interested in, shall we say, church politics or influencing the church internally, I guess is the better way to put it. It's different with Grimke. Grimke, I think it's partly maybe because of his theological education. He had a formal theological education. He was more sort of active in the church, even as a young man in that way. He was a very dedicated churchman. And I'll come back and talk about the implications of that for his position on the life of the church. He was, interestingly enough, he was at one point, and by the way, most Blacks in this period, the period of Jim Crow, who were Presbyterians, were in segregated judicatories. And of course, that's part of the ethos of segregation. You've got Black synods and presbyteries, and you got white ones. He was one of the people living in the Washington area who was able to be in an integrated situation. There was not a separate Black presbytery for the representatives of 15th Street Presbyterian. And I think it's kind of a testament to his extraordinary abilities in a time which he characterized as full of segregation in the church, full of Jim Crow in the church. And I'll come back and talk about that later. He once said at one point, "I've experienced as much race hatred in the church as outside." Let me say that again. I've experienced as much race hatred in the church as outside. But even given that, at one point, he was elected moderator of Washington City Presbytery. I mean, I still have not quite fit those two things together, but it's an astonishing fact that was the case. He was very active in the church at even higher levels, was a commissioner to a General Assembly a couple of times, and from what I can make out, was a thorn in the side of the white leadership of the church all along. I'll get into some of the details of that later. Excuse me. He was very active, however. Very active also in civic affairs. Civic affairs both of the Black community and more broadly, national politics. I mentioned this last time in connection with Garnett, and I want to say it again here. I think one of the most striking things about the role of Presbyterian clergy, I'm not going to generalize beyond that, in the 19th century, in contrast to some extent to what has been the case more recently, is that they sought to be and were public figures, so that their views on all kinds of public issues were right out there, not only for their own parishioners, but for the wider community. I happen to think that's a good thing. And it's a very interesting sort of thing to reflect on, because these people, Henry Highland Garnett, but also now Francis Grimke, made a point of being out there in the NAACP in the case of Grimke, or engaging Woodrow Wilson, trying to engage Woodrow Wilson as a fellow Presbyterian. This was very much a part of their ministry, and it was taken for granted for the most part. that this was the kind of thing that they were supposed to do. Indeed, the session of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church would, when he would make a public address, they typically would publish it. They would publish it. Today it would be on their website, but in those days it was they would produce a pamphlet with Grimke's comments on the war, Grimke's comments on the latest race riot or whatever, so that there could be no question in the wider community of what this church's pastor stood for on all sorts of issues. So, fascinating life, in my opinion. A man who was a public figure, but also an active churchman. Theology. I mentioned the possibility of saying a few words about his theology. There are a couple of very good books on Grimke, and one of them characterizes him as a devoted Calvinist. That's very interesting. A devoted Calvinist. And that's pretty clear from his theological pronouncements. Very characteristic of Reformed thinkers in this period. But he was also, I want to stress, and I think this is maybe somewhat in tension with the first. I can't possibly go into this now, but he was also, in his own way, a kind of evangelical. Now that's the word, of course, which is loaded, fraught with all kinds of different meaning, and it's used today in a way that may be in tension with some other uses in the past. But let me explain what I mean. He said at one point, and I've underlined this in my own note-taking on him, as a Presbyterian pastor, this is toward the end of his life, he said, as a Presbyterian pastor, I see myself as having two main tasks. My first task is to preach the gospel and apply it in a way that will reach as many souls as possible. Now that's pretty orthodox evangelical language, to preach the gospel and apply it in such a way as to reach as many, and then he goes on to say in another passage, souls for Christ. He was a kind of evangelist, and frankly, a little bit of an in-your-face evangelist. When he would encounter somebody, especially a Black intellectual that he thought was not very much a man of faith, he would say, well, let's talk about this. Let's talk about your soul and ultimately your salvation. He would be very open and direct about that, and was clear all through his life that, let me just summarize it with this word, that his ministry had an evangelical purpose. It was not just to tend the flock, it was to, as much as possible, reach out so that more and more people were able to hear what he characterized in that way. But then he said, my other big task is this: to fight racial prejudice with every resource at my disposal. To fight racial prejudice, because he said, that is the cross which we as Negroes, was the common phrase, that is the cross which we all bear. I've already mentioned in a summary way his general view of segregation, but let me now come back and amplify on that. He said, slavery was an evil, despicable evil. And he used exactly the same language that Garnett used in talking about it. He said, I can't imagine anybody reading the Bible and not seeing that this thing is something which would be utterly evil in the eyes of God. Can't imagine. He says, for that reason, I'm just mystified. And it's very interesting how both he and Garnett, sort of rubbing shoulders with members of the white community, would say, it's like they don't get it. Their minds just don't work right. I can't imagine how anybody would not see that slavery is just an evil thing, which is contrary to everything that we as Christians preach. Well, he said the same thing about segregation. He said, let us be perfectly clear about this. As a representative of the Black community, I consider all of these Jim Crow policies, all of these Jim Crow ideas to be utterly wrong. They are contrary to God's will. And as much as possible, we need to get rid of them. We need to get rid of them. But he said, the deeper problem, it's not just these policies, it's what they reflect. And he was very specific about this. He said, those policies would not exist unless there was not racial hatred in this country. Racial hatred. He says, it's not us hating them. He was occasionally accused of being very nasty towards whites. Occasionally, not always, but occasionally he would get the accusation. He said, the root of this problem is not the bitterness or resentment of blacks. The root of this problem is a hatred of blacks, which he said, I still don't understand. I find it inexplicable, but it is something which we live with every day. And he said, as far as I'm concerned, the persistence of this thing, even after the elimination of slavery, the persistence of this thing now, decades after the elimination of slavery, is nothing but shame for America. And certainly God will judge it in time. That same theme which you've heard me talk about in connection with Henry Highland Garnett. I want to give you two examples of his attempt to bring the gospel to bear, this is his way of putting it, in public affairs. I could give you 15, but we would be here longer than the time permits. By the way, let me say parenthetically, one of the most interesting practices that he engaged in, and I haven't really seen many other examples of this. He was a clergyman who would every so often make just these pronouncements on public affairs. And as I said earlier, when he did them, usually in some address, not a sermon, but an address, it would then be picked up on by his own congregants, especially the session, and they would publish these things and make them widely available. Let me give you two examples. In 1913, those of you who were here last year have heard this story, but it's so important I have to repeat it. In 1913, Woodrow Wilson, a fellow Presbyterian, and by the way, Grimke always addressed him that way. You and I are fellow Presbyterians. And indeed, when Wilson took office, he wrote a very, very flowery letter, in my opinion, saying, you and I are kindred spirits. We're both Presbyterians. We both understand the Christian gospel in that way. I look forward to your presidency with great enthusiasm because I know you as a man, a son of the manse, will be able to bring the right values to bear on public life. And then, of course, he was just so sorely disappointed and came in time to sour on Wilson in a very, very profound way. I think the thing which most soured him on Wilson, boy, you can understand this, is that in 1913, Wilson agrees with a couple of members of his cabinet who are both from the South. This is sort of the South permeating the policy making in Wilson's administration, that it's time to segregate the civil service. Now, keep in mind who his parishioners are. My guess is that probably 50 to 75% of the members of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church are civil servants, and probably civil servants who prospered well under a regime which did not segregate the civil service, probably risen to positions of some responsibility. And he knew that the segregation of the civil service was going to be a terrible thing for his own parishioners, but he thought it was just wrong, undemocratic, wrong, 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 wrong. And so he addressed a very, very public condemnation of this to Woodrow Wilson directly. Again, same address. I'm a fellow Presbyterian. Mr. President, please don't do this. This is wrong. This is contrary not only to the Christian gospel, but to democratic values. Now, there is a report. I have not been able to pin this down, and it's only the factual accuracy of it, but there is a report that Wilson granted a meeting with some Black clergy in his office, of which one of the people was Grimke, to address this matter, and they were given the opportunity to make their case most directly. And according to the Presbyterian Historical Society, which is the source of this, when they make this case, Wilson does nothing but talk down to them and tells them basically, I know best. I know you're well-intentioned, but I know best, and does not give an inch on the matter. Grimke is just deeply offended by this and thinks that this is a kind of manifestation of what in fact was the case, a rather deep racism in Woodrow Wilson himself. That's a kind of marvelous illustration of a figure who really is quite out there in the public realm And because of his influence based upon the 15th Street Church platform, is able to rally a lot of other Black leaders to address this issue. The second thing, which I did not know about until reading about Grimke some, is that Grimke was a very strong opponent of the First World War, at least American involvement in the First World War. In particular, he was an opponent of Black soldiers serving in the military in the First World War. He characterized it in pretty stark terms as an imperialist war. He said it's a war among countries that are given to racist policies, and America is the worst of those countries, he said, given to racist policies. This war has arisen primarily because of the colonial competition among these countries, and the idea that Blacks should serve in this war in pursuing the cause of democracy is laughable. Why would you say that? And of course, keep in mind that eventually Woodrow Wilson is characterizing the war effort, the United States involvement in the war effort, as an attempt to make the world safe for democracy. To which Grimke replies, well, it would be nice if we had democracy in the United States. It would be nice if we had democracy in the United States. If we could achieve democracy in the United States, then maybe it would be appropriate for us to begin promoting the democratic cause in the wider world. But the notion that we can hold ourselves out as an example of democracy is laughable. And for that reason, he was very critical of attempts on the part of Du Bois and others to rally Blacks to fight in the war, and he predicted something which turned out to be absolutely the case. And by the way, lots of Blacks did, large numbers. They enrolled in the effort, in the military effort, served in the military, many with distinction. But when they came back, as many of you know, I hope you know, it was a very, very unpleasant reality that they confronted. They were, what quickly happened was there were a whole series of race riots in one city after another, and those race riots were in no small part linked to the fact that the Blacks who'd fought in the war came back expected to be treated differently, and they weren't. And the result was a very, very unpleasant, and he had predicted not exactly the riots, but he predicted this is going to be the likelihood that these men who have served in the military and done and provided service to their country, these Blacks, are going to be given the full rights that they deserve when they come back, the right to the vote and all the jobs and so forth. The likelihood of that happening is not great. This is a kind of, I hope you're getting a feel for it. This is a man who, when he applies his religion to public affairs, there's an edge to it, and there's a definite edge in this case. Now, let me turn to the big debate that was unfolding in Francis Grimke's lifetime among Blacks about how to respond strategically. You will recall, those of you who were here last week, that I talked a lot about the complicated strategic challenge that slavery represented. You may remember I talked about all kinds of different possibilities, some pacifist responses, some militant, violent responses, some people advocating forming political parties. There are all kinds of different possibilities there, and Garnett took a position on that. And by the way, that's what you have to do, as some of you know well, if you're going to get involved in public affairs in a serious way. Immediately, there are these strategic questions. Should we do X? Should we do Y? Should we do Z? Becoming a public figure almost, I would say, by definition, requires you to at some point in those discussions take a position. The big issue that arose in his lifetime, and it really rippled over several decades, was this profound issue, in my opinion. All of us have heard, all of us white folks, let me rephrase that. All of us white folks have heard of Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was an extraordinarily controversial figure in this period, the 1890s through the 19 teens and 20s. Why? because Booker T. Washington was a proponent of a very definite strategy for dealing with segregation. He had founded this Tuskegee Institute. I don't think anybody criticized that. But his approach to education was one which had political overtones. And those overtones were as follows. They're summarized very nicely in a famous address he gave in 1893, by the way, at the bidding of whites, at the bidding of white folks who were very anxious to have publicly expressed what he'd privately been expressing for a long time. In 1893, this address was called, it's subsequently known, and it's in all the anthologies on race relations in the history of the United States. It's the famous Atlanta Compromise speech, 1893, Atlanta Compromise. And it was an open appeal to the white community. And the appeal was this: we're treated badly. He openly says we're treated badly. And part of the reason that we're treated badly is that you don't think very, very highly of our capabilities as a race. And therefore you're putting obviously the best face on the white suspicion of blacks voting. He said, you're obviously very worried about the possibility of us being able to have the franchise. So let's make a deal. I'm summarizing here, paraphrasing, if you will, but the deal was this: we'll forget about the vote. At least we'll forget about the vote for a long time. If in return you will grant us opportunities to do the kind of work and have the kind of economic opportunities which are appropriate for us. Let me say that again. We'll forget about the franchise. We'll forget about voting. We'll forget about all that stuff. We won't bother you in that regard. You can dominate our public life. If in return you grant us peacefully, get off our backs, if you grant us peacefully the kind of economic opportunities which are appropriate for us. And basically what that meant was the kind of work which we today would characterize as manual labor. And he said the kind of course, part of giving us the chance to have these opportunities is granting us educational opportunities, manual labor opportunities, which will enable us to participate in the trades, and also, he said, and some of us to engage in entrepreneurial activity. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, the NAACP really attacked it. And attacked it very strongly for two reasons. Number one, they said, in effect, this whole line of argument grants the fundamental premise of segregation, which is black inferiority. Let me say that again. It grants the fundamental premise of segregation, which is black inferiority. We're not up to taking good advantage of the rights and opportunities of American citizens who are not black. The other thing, of course, was that it implied that only education which was not in the higher forms was appropriate for blacks. The NAACP was filled at that time. Keep in mind, Du Bois is the driving force behind the NAACP, but the Grimke brothers are also in there. They were filled with people who were devotees of the liberal arts, of the kind of education which enables people to aspire to something more than manual labor. And they saw this compromise as a kind of pigeonholing of the black community in a way that excluded them from those sorts of opportunities. Grimke's position on this, and I hope you see why, as I go along, education is so related to politics again and again. Educational philosophy, if you will, is so related to politics again and again. Grimke's position, very simply, it wasn't complicated at all. He said, we as black men and women have the same should have the same opportunities and be treated the same way as any other citizen in this nation. We should be given the opportunity to take advantage of education as fully and completely as anybody else, and to rise to as high a level of educational attainment and in turn professional attainment as we can. And the other thing, of course, he just hammered this point. He said, we cannot give up the vote. The vote is crucial to everything about our advancement. Indeed, at one point, he gave a lecture in which he said, sort of a riff on the NAACP advancement. He said, the whole point of our struggle is to advance, and the way to advance is through the franchise. If we don't have the franchise, we will be denied the opportunities that we need again and again and again. So to summarize his position, he's really a proponent of what today we would characterize as equality of educational opportunity. Equality of educational opportunity, which in his mind was very closely linked with the opportunities for Blacks to vote. And by the way, at some points, he would come back to this issue of, are we ready? Critics of giving Blacks the vote was to say, most of them are not ready. Well, they weren't ready in a certain sense, absolutely. As long as you've got a lack of literacy, you've got a problem. But the response of Grimke and those who thought as he did was, the way to respond to that is to expand the opportunities for literacy, and not just low-level literacy, but all the other possibilities as well. By the way, when I say liberal arts, I mean not just the humanities, but also the sciences. He was a big proponent of scientific education and thought that it was very important for the Black community to be able to get access to the kind of learning which would enable them to become professionals in the sciences, as well as those fields where the humanities were the main educational tool. That's one part of Francis Grimke on the great strategic issue of the time. To summarize it, Booker T. Washington is wrong, wrong, wrong. We need a strategy which enables us as much as possible to have equality of opportunity in all aspects. He was also, however, a moralist. And I find this very, very interesting. In all of his talk about this, he was a person who was a moralist and almost a moralizer. He said, our advancement as Blacks is inseparably linked to our moral advancement. Let me say that again. Our advancement as Blacks is very, very closely linked to moral advancement. He's got a wonderful 2 or 3 different times in these lectures that were published. He does the following thing. He does a kind of parody. He says, the white people have got a kind of stereotype of us. And he said, it's a pretty mean stereotype, but there's a little truth to it. Let's be honest with you. There's this kind of, and at one point he uses the term vicious. He says there's this vicious stereotype out there of what it is to be a Black person. And I'll just repeat some of the phrases he uses. Yeah, those Black people are shiftless. They're lazy. They're dishonest. They're undisciplined. And oversexed. All of that. That's the way they are. And he said, that is a vicious stereotype, but the only way to effectively counter that stereotype is the following: to create in the Black community, to cultivate in the Black community the set of moral qualities that we, at least as people of faith, all agree are the right ones. Cultivate actively certain moral qualities in especially our youth growing up. He was very concerned about the family as the sort of source of moral formation. And so you get in Francis Grimke the articulation of a very clear idea of what it means to be a good person. He did over and over again. And here are some of the images, some of the themes which are a part of it. He says, it's very important for us to be sober. He was a very strong proponent of temperance. And by the way, he saw alcoholism as a very serious scourge of the Black community, and would discuss that. Keep in mind, this is the time in which prohibition talk is very, very widespread, and it was not uncommon for let me speak for whites, white progressives, to be very active proponents of temperance, by which they oftentimes meant prohibition. So sober. The second thing it's very important for us to be and teach our children to be is thrifty. And closely related to that, wise in the use of money. Another very important quality that needs to be cultivated actively so as to counteract this vicious stereotype is industriousness. We need to come to be recognized as people who can be reliably counted on to work hard at honest labor. Another very important quality which he urged to be cultivated is civic mindedness. He says people need to think more, to be taught not just to think of themselves, but to think about their responsibilities toward the wider community. Another theme which comes up again and again as he talks about these matters having to do with sexuality is modesty. He says, I think modesty is an important quality that needs to be encouraged and cultivated. Above all, he said, what needs to be cultivated in the Black community is pride in ourselves. Pride in ourselves being a certain kind of people who are all the things I mentioned, and above all, are responsible for their own well-being and doing all they can to make the best use of their opportunities. Now, some of you, my guess is, have already drawn a conclusion, which I'm now going to draw myself. This is the Protestant ethic. This whole lineup is the Protestant ethic. Those of you who've read Max Weber, that's exactly what he had in mind when he used that famous phrase. There's a certain ethic that is actively cultivated by Protestants historically, and here is Grimke now picking up on it and treating it as a kind of very important resource in the shall I say the self-protection of the Black community. Indeed, one of the best writers on the subject characterizes Grimke, and by the way, this apparently was a phrase that was used already by other people at the time, as the Black Puritan. He was the Black Puritan. Who was a proponent of a certain kind of approach to life, the one that I've just described, which would be of great value to the Black community. And then to complete this point, he said, for all these reasons that I've just described, for all these reasons, the importance of these moral values and the promotion of these moral values and the countering of the white stereotype about us, the Black church has a crucial role. The Black church has a crucial role to play. It is the place above all where these kinds of qualities can be actively cultivated. What about the white church? Is the white church something that we can look to play a role in the meeting the challenge of segregation? The answer potentially is yes. It would make an enormous difference, he says, an enormous difference if race prejudice were consistently treated in the white churches as a sin. Enormous difference. Could change the whole trajectory of American history if that were to happen. The absence of it, however, he says, is an obvious thing and it's a scandal. That just is not what's happening in our churches. What is needed, he says, and he kept saying this over and over again through the years. You can imagine in one Presbyterian gathering after another with all sorts of whites present. What is needed is an ongoing campaign against Jim Crow in the churches. The white churches need consistently to preach that all the attitudes connected with racism are sinful, and there should be no compromise on this. There should be no compromise whatsoever. Unfortunately, he said, almost at every turn there is compromise. Indeed, more often than not, in the white churches, the practice is just the opposite. To treat offense at racism as something which is in the opinion held by a certain number of people, but the vast majority don't think of it as anything wrong. I want to cite two instances here where this came to a head in his own life in the PC USA. In the aftermath of the Civil War, it will not surprise you to hear that, and I didn't know as much about this prior to working on this topic as I should, but in the aftermath of the Civil War, there had been, of course, the separation of the Northern Church and the Southern Church, a complete split. In the aftermath of the Civil War, there were people on both sides who said this disunion is a terrible thing. We need to get back together. And so there were union talks on and off in the 1880s, and the 1890s, and on into the early 1900s, several different episodes at which people in the North and the South tried to work out plans of union. There was also, at the same time, a conversation between the larger Northern Church and the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, a regional church in the area of Tennessee and slightly beyond, trying to work out some kind of possibility of merger there. All along, as these merger talks developed, and they were matters that were brought to the attention of members of presbyteries and synods and ultimately the General Assembly, at every single point, Grimke opposed the union plans, actively opposed them. At several points in his appearances before Presbyterian bodies, characterized them as in the following terms. He said, I have no problem with church union in principle. It's a great thing. But if church union is to be achieved in such a way as to perpetuate the marginalization and subjugation of Blacks, it should never even be contemplated. And what he saw in these union plans was concessions to segregationists in order to make the union possible. They never happened as a result. These union plans never materialized. Now, I don't want to say, as a result is too strong. He was one of the voices, and apparently an eloquent voice, who actively opposed them. And by the way, very interesting thing to note, I just learned recently, one of the people who shared that view was an elder at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church named John Harlan. Now, you students of Supreme Court history may remember that John Harlan was a justice of the Supreme Court and the author of a crucial dissent on the Plessy versus Ferguson case. He was a very active Presbyterian layman and a good friend of Francis Grimke. And apparently the two of them actively resisted this attempt on the part of people in the presbytery to get the presbytery's support for this particular action. By the way, there's a wonderful new biography of Harlan out, in which apparently this whole business of his views on race and their links to his churchmen, his role in the church is actively discussed. And by the way, the senior pastor of that church, Wallace Radcliffe was his name. This is the David Jesse question from last week. David Jesse, I think, asked me, did Henry Highland Garnett have any friends, any white friends? And I was hard put to identify any. Well, the senior pastor at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church apparently was a very close confidant, white man, very close confidant of Francis Grimke. And that sort of the three of them, the pastor of that church, John Harlan, who was, of course, widely respected in the presbytery, and Grimke would work together to resist these sort of pressures for union that entailed some compromises with Jim Crow. Let me conclude with a summary of a topic which Grimke addressed at least a dozen times in the course of his active ministry. Every once in a while, he would give an address which had essentially the following topic. As we are now 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years beyond the abolition of slavery, how are things going for the Negroes? Are we making any progress? And if you read those addresses, most of which are available, by the way, in a very interesting little deposit online, publications By the way, you'll love this. There's now an organization called the Dead Presbyterian Society. It's a play on, of course, that famous Dead Poets Society. There's an organization called Dead Presbyterian Society, and they have a website called Log College Press. And Log College Press is a collection of documents, mainly having to do with race, from all of these, many of these figures that from the 19th and early 20th century that I'm discussing. So you can find literally about half a dozen of these major addresses, the text of them at that website. The theme running through Grimke's sort of discussion of this problem, decade after decade after decade, it's a wonderful kind of sort of tracing out of the history. The basic theme again and again is this: yes, 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 some progress has been made. As a Black man, I would say, yes, some progress has been made. At least we're not slaves anymore. Some progress has been made. And he would go on to say sometimes, steady progress is being made to the extent that you can see people's eyes are being opened here and there. People's eyes are being opened here and there to the utter wrongness of slavery and then of segregation. But again and again, he says, racism is still so strong, so very strong. Indeed, in some respects, he said in 1913, the time when he was taking on Wilson, he said, in some respects, the racism is actually getting worse. And he says, I think it's related to the fact that the more we attempt to make progress, the more resistance there is in the white community. He says, sometimes I feel as though the hatred towards us is worse now than it was before slavery. And then he concludes with this statement: one could easily despair. One could easily despair. And I would, he said. I certainly would, if I were not a man of faith. He says, it's no surprise to me that many Blacks who are not men and women of faith do despair or have very cynical views about whites. But he says, because I believe in the God of the Bible, who is just, I do have hope, and I have to have hope. And I am convinced that in his own time, God will solve this problem. He retired in the mid-1920s with some health problems, lived on to 1937. So we saw the Depression, lived on the threshold of the Second World War. Let me stop there. We have a little time for questions, Kathy. Or comments, I should say, comments as well as questions.
And yeah, since we have a couple of screens, if you can use the raise hand function, which is under reactions, that is helpful because it moves you up to the first screen. Betty, yes, sorry.
I have a question, which doesn't specifically relate to Black clergy. In your talks through the years, you keep, there's a theme that you keep raising, which is that in past decades, the clergy were often public figures. They were people like Reinhold Niebuhr, were people whose pictures were on the front of Time magazine, and who engaged in public debate. And you said that no longer is the case. And now, in speaking of this era of Black clergy, you made the same statement that they were public figures. So What's your explanation for what's happened? Why are our clergy no longer, do they no longer play that role?
Well, let me say 2 or 3 things about that. First thing is, I made that statement last week and I still think it's true, but let me qualify it just a bit. I think there are, in the latter part of the 20th century and on into the 21st century, some clergy who are public figures. The interesting thing is, I think they are more on the fewer and fewer of them are from what I would characterize as the mainline Protestant denominations. They are from startup churches, whether it be Jerry Falwell or Rick Warren or whatever. They're more from that world. And if you were sort of mapping as to where are how have things evolved with regard to the role of clergy as public figures, you would have to say that in the latter part of the 20th century and on into the 21st century, those figures have risen to the forefront, while at the same time mainline Protestant clergy have receded in importance. And I would say there are also Black clergy. William Farmer, for example, and others that one could mention. So I want to qualify it just a bit. I think the most important reason is this, especially with regard to mainline Protestant clergy. That's what I'm talking about, Presbyterians. You could say much the same thing about Episcopalians. There was a period all the way through the 19th century and into the first part of the 20th century when the people attending our kind of church and providing leadership in our kind of church took for granted that they were the dominant voices in American religion, that this was a Protestant country of a certain kind, and they represented the leadership of the kind of Protestantism which was hegemonic, which was most influential in American society. That assumption faded. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that assumption has been profoundly compromised in the direction of a new way of thinking about religion and public life in our society, which I would say to a large extent, not entirely, to a large extent, calls into question the validity of a particular religious tradition being dominant in our public life. That's what's implied in the term pluralism, of course. And I think clergy in our denomination in particular, but not just our denomination, have absorbed that. Now, the last point I would make on this is my own view about that is I don't think there's any problem at all with playing a public role from a position of one contributor among others rather than the leading voice. But we're yet to work that out.
Other questions? If not, I have a quick one. I was fascinated that you mentioned that he actually served as moderator of, I guess, what was Washington City Presbytery at the time.
Exactly.
When did that happen? Do you have any insight into why it happened, basically?
I have no insight. And believe me, I have been looking. It happened in 1900, right at the turn of the century. And I'm tempted to speculate, but I'm not going to do that. I think it's extraordinary. And I think given, by the way, he was somewhat selective in his engagement with Presbytery. And he said this was the reason. He said, there are a lot of contexts in Presbytery where I really don't think I'm comfortable being there. There's such a kind of undercurrent of racism that I'm not going to align myself with those projects and those people. So he would openly say, and as I earlier said, he at one point said, I've encountered as much or more racism inside the church as outside of the church. So he was not, shall we say, the kind of person who just routinely served on committees and participated sort of if it was an event of the church judicatory. So given that, it's all the more astonishing, I think, that he would be given that opportunity. And I wish I knew, Kathy. I just don't.
Well, it is fascinating just thinking about how they would have, if there were meals involved, how they would have negotiated, things that we are, relatively simple, but would have been complicated at the time.
Well, there are a couple of things in his private papers where he talks about the difficulties of those sorts of things. And he says at one point, why is it that the church can't just, as it did eventually, of course, let me be clear, this is what the 50s and 60s were all about, but why can't the church just insist that if there's going to be a meeting where a meal is served, then by God, you're going to have blacks and whites sitting at table together, or we're not going to have it.
Yeah.
Rather than that, the common assumption was we will have it in the segregated way.
Well, thank you very much. We are a little past 10:30, so I think we should end. And we will look forward to next week. Do you want to give us a brief preview of next week?
Gay Wilmore. Gay Wilmore, who is a figure who played a very important role in moving the denomination, that is the Northern Church, the UPUSA, towards engagement in the civil rights struggle of the 50s and 60s, and later became a rather important scholar in the field of Black church history. So I'll be talking about him next time.
We will look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Say hi to Carol.